wonderful staff who are here helping us out. My name is Gemma Field. I'm the Associate Head of Research here at the Yale Centre for British Art, and I am delighted to welcome you back to day 2 of our symposium, Thinking Through Tea, Art, Resistance and Global Entanglements in the Age of American Independence. This symposium marks the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence by approaching the revolutionary moment through objects, images, and everyday practices. Across 4 roundtable sessions, we'll be thinking together about how material culture such as tea, sugar, textiles, and silver shaped experiences of allegiance, resistance, and identity within a global imperial context. Alongside the symposium, the YCBA has installed a display upstairs on the 4th floor and in our study room on the 2nd floor, which I really encourage you to spend time with while you're here. It brings together paintings and prints from our collection that sit on both sides of this conflict and open up some of the complexity and contradictions of the period. This program has really been a highly collaborative effort, and I'd like to thank colleagues across the YCBA whose work and support have made it possible, and especially to my colleagues in the research department, Christina Ferrando, Susie Beckham, and Jen Collins. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners at the Lunder Institute for American Art who have collaborated with us in shaping the program, particularly Erica Wall and her colleagues Gillian Scott, Caitlin Clark, and Mary McGrail. And finally, my sincere thanks to all of our speakers for their generosity in sharing their time and expertise with us over these 2 days. I'll end with a few quick housekeeping notes. The symposium is being live streamed and recorded. It will be made available on our website. If you're joining us remotely, please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. If you're here in person, please wait for a microphone during the Q&A. We'll guide you throughout today with scheduled breaks, but you can also find a full schedule of the day on our website. And now it is my pleasure to hand over to Erica Wall, Director of the Lunder Institute. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. It's a pleasure to see you. If this is your first day of this amazing 2-day symposium, welcome. And if it is your second and you joined us for an amazing panel last night, welcome back to Lunder Institute at the Yale Center for British Art. We are so thankful and grateful to have the YCBA as our partner. And this is the third iteration of Lunder Institute which was established in 2024. The Lunder Institute for American Art is, for all intents and purposes, a think tank. We really reside at the intersection of art making, scholarship, and research, and we are a think tank for the Colby College Museum of Art, but for the field of American art and beyond. And the Lunder Institute program was designed to have a space for institutions to be in conversation with one another, which made perfect sense in this very special year of 2026 as we acknowledge the anniversary of our nation's 250th anniversary of independence, that we collaborate with those that help us to better understand the relationships that are part of our origin story, have shaped us, and continue to shape us today, such as those with this relationship this year. Our cohort is made up of the Yale Center for British Art, the Tate Britain, the Royal Academy of Art, and the Peggy Guggenheim. And so I want to specifically thank today the YCBA for being in partnership and the amazing staff here for working with us, specifically Martina Droff, its director, Rachel Chattelbash, its deputy director. A special thanks to Gemma Field for designing and developing these programs, along with Christina Ferrando and Laurel Peterson, and of course, other parts and members of the institution and staff that have helped. And so with that, I always and forever am grateful to Peter and Paula Lunder and the Lunder Foundation for making the Lunder Institute possible and for creating this amazing and really unique platform for us to be in conversation and community. So again, my thanks to all of you for being here, to the YCBA, and join me in enjoying this program today. And I will now hand it over to Ramita Ray.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Erica, for sponsoring this amazing conference and so much to learn even today. I think we kicked off the symposium on a high note yesterday. My name is Romita Ray. I teach art and architectural history at Syracuse University, and I also work on tea. I'm in fact steeped in tea, I think, at some level. So hopefully I'll be able to summarize things for you today. But before I share some thoughts about the painting that you see on the screen, well, you won't see it quite yet, but let me at least introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Jennifer Anderson, who is Associate Professor of History from Stony Brook University. If you can just wave, Jennifer, so we know who you are. Thank you. Zara Annis-Henslin, who is Associate Professor of History and Art History, as well as the Director of Museum Studies and Public Engagement at the University of Delaware. So in the middle, and then the lovely John Stewart Gordon. Some of you may know him, who is the Benjamin Atmore Hewitt Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Yale University Art Gallery across the street. So what we're going to do is set up the stage for you a little bit here. And I'm going to focus on a painting that, moving ahead here, that was included by Laurel Peterson and Holly Schaefer in their fabulous exhibition upstairs. And I really want to thank Gemma and Christina for drawing my attention to using this as a node of discussion before we open up the session to our panelists. So the first thing that I would say as someone who works on tea, looking at this particular image, and I want to draw your attention to this as well, is that when William Daniel paints this image, he has traveled to China with his uncle, Thomas Daniel, and they are actually en route to India. But they get out there and they do sketch along the Pearl River in China. So the river is the element of this landscape that I really want you to pay attention to. And I say this in part because this brought to mind Lisa Lowe's wonderful observation that when we think about these broad scale, these massive scale histories and geographies, we're looking at the braided parts of a world-making process, which are really defined by cash crops, by commerce, by slavery as it came up yesterday, by war and by violence. Now, while we have the riverine in the view, I just wanted to remind us that we're shifting from maritime trade, so where the ocean is your great space of war and revolution. We are all familiar with some of the incidents described on this, or rather shown to you on the screen here. And this is one moment where you actually do see tea being dumped into not only the ocean, but tea as an edible. You rarely see this unless you're looking at herbarium specimens, which are a whole other story altogether. So while we have the Boston Tea Party, we also have, at the same time in India, a steady influx of tea into the city of Calcutta, where I grew up, which till this day is the center of the tea trade in India. So just a reminder of the two different poles of engagements with tea as a commodity that's shifting and moving across the world through the China trade, creating mayhem along the way, as we've seen here. So back to our painting. William Daniel's view in China, cultivating the tea plant, is perhaps, as Kitu Choi has analyzed, it's perhaps looking to works by Chinese artists who are making paintings for both European as well as American consumers, like the one that you see to the side from the Peabody Essex Museum. And it's very beautifully included in the caption upstairs in the exhibition. So you can see the multi-tiered arrangement, but I want to draw your attention to the tea fields on either side and across actually William Daniel's painting as well. So those sort of very carefully delineated, stunted tea bushes that you see. And this brings me to another series of paintings that were very popular at the time. These were made oftentimes on pith paper, this one on European paper, but there's a wonderful set of examples upstairs as well. But these were the kinds of images that you would see rooted in Confucian ideals of discipline, harmony, order, and a nod to Zara's work on silk, because this tradition comes out of looking at sericulture and rice rice cultivation in China, which will be adopted also for the orderliness of tea cultivation, as you see here. And that's precisely the kind of puzzle in William Daniels's painting displayed for us, but knitted together in a very picturesque fashion. Again, very different from what you see in, let's say, someone like Richard Wilson's painting also in this collection here, where the Serpentine River becomes a motif, a kind of standard motif in picturesque landscape paintings. In Daniel's painting, what is extraordinary is that the landscape has become an economically productive landscape. You see tea fields, you see the boxing of tea, you see the roasting of tea. So you literally see tea from plant to manufacture to trade, all in one painting or one composition. So we've shifted from just a purely aesthetic view to one that shows you a productive view. And this is just to give you some guiding lines as to how the river meanders, and it opens up your view. You're encouraged as you wind your way through, as your eye winds its way through, to look at these different areas of production. Now, the tea bush itself is an object of mystery. So 1792, George Macartney, as many of you know, the Macartney embassy to China is a failure, but they do encounter tea plants during their travels. So by the time Daniel makes this particular image of the tea tree, he's plucking literally from different sources, not only from the Macartney embassy sort of recollections, he's looking at natural history literature. And the tea bush is a quasi-bonsai technique of growing a tea. So it's growing tea. So it's really an artifact, a botanical artifact of sorts. But it brings me to the other side of the world, where we have seen for a while now, in the Caribbean especially, plantation economies that have put forward plants like indigo that are looking at tobacco as sources of profit. And if you look at the bottom right corner of the engraving, you see people again manually plucking the leaves, just as you see over here with the tea pickers. So this question of, again, an artisanal industry, and then Bengal, where the tea industry will develop later on in the 19th century, is also where indigo is transplanted and planted. And of course, India has a long, long tradition of indigo cultivation since antiquity. But we're back to the East India Company and the extent to which tea is enshrined even in the ceiling painting in the revenue room. This is the East India Company, shown to you as literally Britannia receiving riches from the East, and circled for you is a tea box, very precious commodity sitting right there. Looks very humble, but in fact it's very, very expensive. So looking ahead now, we've looked at the Boston Tea Party, we've looked at China. Chinese tea is flowing through India, as I mentioned. This is an example now from William Griffith of the kinds of views that they would see in the 1830s, when the first tea expedition, official tea expedition, is commissioned by the government of India. William Griffith is a botanist, and I'd like you to see the similarity in river views. One is a productive landscape in China. The other one is complete and utter forested landscapes. Tea as a wild plant growing along this particular river that they find in Assam. Which brings us, of course, to the contemporary tea industry. So I just wanted to flag a few images for you to think about tea in Daniel's painting and where it will arrive in the story of India. Assam tea is indigenous to India. It will be cloned or mixed or hybridized, I should say, with Chinese tea to create the Indian tea industry as we know today. And over to you. So John, I think you're next. Is that it in the order of things? Or who's going next?
Well, we were just going to talk.
We're going to talk. All right. We're good at that. Okay. That's just setting the stage.
Maybe I can be useful. What a wonderful image, which is not mine. Whose is this?
Jenny's.
Okay. Hey, Jenny.
Well, kind of building on this introduction, thinking about tea as a commodity, organic plant that's being grown and all that was involved with that. I think others on the panel are going to be looking at the way in which the consumption of that commodity gives rise to this entire world of material culture that didn't exist before, and that you see, going across all mediums over time, evolving through different aesthetics and design and fashions, and turning what had been a luxury into something that becomes a necessity and that reaches across all classes and ethnic groups and racial groups. And when I was a student at Winterthur, my wonderful professor, Kenneth Ames, talked about tea as a commodity that was downwardly mobile, as something that starts as a luxury and becomes, right, this pervasive thing. And you see that in the material culture. And today, I struggle often to make my students understand, like to feel what that really meant, because if you think of the casualness, which, you take a tea bag, you make a cup of tea, what do you do with the tea bag? So you really have to work to get back into this world. And so this particular image shows the early 1730 father and child with this assemblage of silver and porcelain. And interestingly, the child is drinking tea as well. I think the way he's posed, holding the teacup is very evocative for me. What do you think when you look at that?
I love this painting. Also, that assemblage on the table in front of them is just ostentatious. You have, because it's more than tea. So this is ostensibly about drinking one beverage, but you have an entire world arrayed on that, from the 8-form shaped tea caddy, which is looking at contemporary architecture of the 1730s, to what is probably a coffee pot. You have the piriform or the pear-shaped teapot. Like, multiple things are being used here. You have the waste bowl that could also be a punch bowl. So you have, stimulating in 2 directions. There's just the whole world is on this table, and but it's a world that is inaccessible to most, because even if that is just lowly pewter, that is still incredibly costly table.
Wearing a banyan.
He is wearing a banyan, a silk banyan. Yes.
So to kind of pull this thread, thinking about the way in which we see, tea becoming kind of a catalyst for the development of new forms of material culture, I was thinking about, in my own work on mahogany, this was certainly an important area in which we see a high-end tropical woods becoming the desirable thing. And at the same time, so you see here, again, entirely new forms that hadn't existed before. A kettle stand, the tea box, tea chest, which invariably they had locks on them so that your precious tea could be secured. A tea board, which was what we would call today a tea tray. And if you couldn't afford a tea table, you would definitely want to have a tea board. And then I selected, just to contrast, again, the way we see this form. Here you have a very high style turret top. It's called tea table, which is designed with those little curves. So each one, you would put a porcelain teacup there. So it functions as display of this lavish wood as well as for your porcelain. And then a more modest interpretation of the same form in a local wood that was done by an artisan in North Carolina. But almost every home would have some combination of these artifacts that you wouldn't have found, a couple decades before. Thoughts?
I'll hold my thoughts.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, can I just jump in for a second?
Oh, yeah.
One of the things that struck me about both the images, and including this one, is the high polish on the tables as well. Because one of the attractive or the appealing aspects of tea drinking is that you're drinking out of very shiny things, right? Whether it's the porcelain gleaming, whether it's silver, and then the reflections of the table also create these double images almost, right? So overall, there's kind of this magical sense of all these different surfaces jostling for attention. So once again, that sort of idea of the high luxury good. But I have to say that tea is also being consumed by servants at this time as well. And there are different grades of tea that are reserved for those who are the actual members of the family, and servants who get to have the lesser quality teas. There are also teas designed, sort of designated for different parts of a household, what you would have in your bedroom, what you would have in your parlor. Yes, if you look at ducal ledgers, household ledgers, you see this quite often. So it's very interesting to see the sort of Downton Abbey-esque version, right? The upstairs, downstairs version, if you read it through just the way the tea is moving through the household and which objects are being used to stage it.
Yeah.
To riff off that word staging, I threw this in because we think about, also, here's like our poster child for this whole event. And all of the images we've been looking at, from the Hogarth last night to this, when you see these tables in action, you see the goods arrayed on the top of them, we focus on that. That's not how these tables lived their lives. You know, this is a mobile world where furniture comes away from the walls to be used, and then it goes back to the walls, so a room could be repurposed. So you have to we think about these objects in motion transatlantically, ideas in motion transatlantically, but within your parlor, everything is in motion. And I wanted just to remind you that this is what a tea table looked like if you weren't having tea. You know, most of them are hinged, they tip up, and then you start understanding why there's a hierarchy of woods. Because mahogany is gorgeous. And I challenge, these are amongst the first abstract paintings to enter a home. Now, these are sitting in parlors where people are just looking at, you know, the chatoyance, the way light fractures across the surface and reflects within the wood. They become, you know, like landscape paintings in their own, or these just swirls of light. And so these are objects that are fetishized for themselves. And then you put the whole equipage on top of it, and the people around it, and the room, and the architecture, and the landscape. But you know, the fetishization starts right at the very core. Brings us to mahogany.
So given my particular interest as an environmental and labor historian who looks at material culture, this is where I wanted to connect with some of the themes about the movement of botanical specimens and the labor involved with not just tea, but all of these accoutrements and new forms of material culture that are developing around it. And I think this is often the hidden story, the hidden labor, that because to achieve an artifact like the one that we were just looking at, it goes back to how the tree grew in the rainforest and how the tree was cut. Because if you cut the tree one way, it produces a different grain of the wood. And so you have not just these commodities flowing back and forth, but also people, the workers, the merchants, the shippers involved with it, and knowledge going back and forth. And during the period that I focus on in the 18th century, the consumer demand for this material, mahogany and other tropical hardwoods, is so intense by the end of the 18th century, and so many rainforests being sacrificed to grow sugar, which was also in high demand. One of the more intriguing things that I was researching was British efforts to transplant mahogany trees to India, so that you could presumably be able to create the tea furnishings right there where you were growing the tea. And sadly, that didn't work out so well.
Well, there's a whole other species of mahogany in South Asia, which is, endemic to that area. But you know, I love the fact that you brought up the idea of deforestation as well, because that is really what will create the tea industry in India. Right? These masses, or these vast stretches of forested land in Assam, in North Bengal, which are all riverine areas. So it's incredibly fertile land. And of course, with forest soil, you have the terroir to grow tea. And it's fascinating because right around the time that We've got tea being dumped in the Boston Harbor. Right around that time is Joseph Banks, who's talking about where do we transplant tea? Where do we take it from China? And India immediately comes up as a place. Assam is annexed from Burma, from Myanmar. So there's a whole set of, again, war, revolution. We always focus on the Atlantic Ocean as the area of revolt, or for that matter, even the Opium Wars. But the Assam-Burma, Anglo-Assam Wars, Anglo-Burma Wars are very, very important for also setting up the tea industry in India. But all of that has to do with deforestation in the end. Yeah. The entire landscape's being reshaped, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then I pulled two slides that we'll go through quickly that really I just wanted to kind of, you can see I ran out of time. I was planning to have many more examples, as if you can visualize, if you've ever been to one of our major museums in Europe or in America.
Or across the street.
Or across the street. That they have these incredible arrays of, what's a relatively simple utilitarian object, to hold your leaves and some hot water while they're steeping, but it becomes this vehicle for cultural expression and kind of harkening back to yesterday's discussion about how the consumption goes beyond choosing what kind of tea or what grade of tea you're going to buy, to how your individual presentation of this social ritual is going to reflect your sense of identity and taste. My personal favorite has always been that wacky teapot with the fossils. That there's one like that at Winter Tour that I was always enthralled with, because it kind of was a big area of interest in the 18th century, and it shows up in the ceramics industry. Other thoughts?
I'm going to save it because we're open.
I was just going to say, I love that fossil teapot really shows how the scientific and the aesthetic go hand in hand so often in this world. And I think it's a huge part of silk, for example, which I'll talk about in a minute. Yes, but I love that.
And similarly, from that first image we showed where you saw the father and child with the assemblage, you also have this rise of match sets, which you see that in dinnerwares and other things as well, but especially with tea-related material culture, that it's not enough to have the teapot. Now you also have to have, all of these things matching sets, to the extent that manufacturers in Europe and in China, like the Chinese export porcelain that you see on the right, that set was made commissioned from China by a father, and he had 3 sons. So he commissioned 3 sets, and each of his sons got a matched set of these federal style ceramics that were, being made in China, but clearly catering to American consumers. And then and then you've got the cauliflower ware.
Who doesn't love the cauliflower?
So something for every taste. How do you decide?
Multiples.
And I just wanted to, these are all international objects. I mean, there's a story. It's foregrounded, it's in the background, it's somewhere. And I just wanted to kind of highlight a favorite object of ours from across the street, which is this tea caddy that a father makes for his daughter. So again, like the interfamily discussions. And it's kind of an icon of the field because it's the earliest dated piece of Pennsylvania redware, so 1767. But it's fascinating because this decoration is not local. I really think it's looking to Palampours. So these Indian textiles that are crossing the Atlantic somehow are getting registered in either a literal way or a memory in kind of rural Pennsylvania and getting refashioned. And what's then even more fascinating, this is the Pennsylvania Dutch landscape, which is so known for this kind of redware with this glaze. But as Lily Higgins, a recent Yale graduate and now at the Walters, has uncovered, and she's sitting right in front of me, everyone look at Lily. So she has uncovered really who Joseph Smith is, and he's kind of part of the Anglo community. And like you have this, so you have all of these cultural bleedings happening. You have, someone of an Anglo heritage living within a Germanic kind of landscape, quoting a textile that is looking back to India. Maybe they're aware of any of this. Maybe they're not. And I'm going to put in a plug that I really hope this gets published. Because we also now want to do testing on what was in this tea caddy to figure out, are there any traces, so we could figure out which grade of tea was there, what was happening on the Smith's tea table. But these are all, we see them out of context today, but these are all incredibly global international objects, whether or not the users were terribly aware of that. And sometimes it's where the money comes from. The sugar bowl is probably my favorite object in the art gallery's collection. Don't tell all the other objects. It was made in New York in 1730s by a Huguenot craftsman, Simeon Soumain, who comes to New York. He is commissioned to make a partial tea service. This idea that the tea service grows. He makes 2 trays, some spoons, and a tea bowl for Elizabeth Kruger, who was born in Jamaica. She marries Henry Kruger. He brings her back to New York, where the Kruger family owns one of the wharves. So we get into the commerce side. You see these ads for the auctions that are taking place on Kruger's Wharf in New York. So he owns the wharf and the boats that are transmitting things between Jamaica and New York. So not directly in the slave and sugar trade, but assisting it. So then you have this idea of an object to hold sugar, made with sugar money. And to the question about the image last night, I actually wonder in 1730s New York, what was more expensive, this silver sugar bowl or the porcelain Chinese rice bowl it's based on? If you had one of those, you were definitely in the 1%. And it's like the 1% plus who got the silver version. And then even more elaborate is this set of gold flatware. It's the only known British colonial gold flatware. And it was also made in New York, but probably owned by Hugh Hall in Boston, who was the largest enslaver in New England in this period. And he is born and raised in Jamaica, in the Caribbean. He comes to Boston to go to Harvard and decides to stay there. And he becomes the North American anchor for his family's slave trade. And so just, again, behind all of these objects, these are luxury goods. But as we study America, especially in the mid-18th century up to the Revolutionary War, if there is a fortune in colonial America, scratch the surface and you get the Caribbean, either directly or indirectly. It's where all of the wealth is coming from. And my final rant on this subject is a very recent acquisition we made. These are candlesticks made in the mid-century in Jamaica. And they're fabulous. There's been recent scholarship that's really kind of unpacked the Jamaican silver trade. And I don't have the graph because it's a handwritten graph by Robert Barker made in the 1980s. He was a British silver scholar. He charted all of the exports of silver out of England and Wales to the New World. In like 1750, for example, there are 1,500 ounces of silver being imported into New York, 1,500 ounces of silver being imported to Philadelphia, 1,500 ounces being imported into New England, total 7,000 ounces going to Jamaica alone. All of the silver being imported from England and Wales into New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies does not equal the amount of silver going to one island in the Caribbean. That tells you how iniquitous the wealth was. And that silver it's circulating, it's going into households, and there is local production. And this is, I think these candlesticks were owned by a member of the Livingston family of New York. And Henry Livingston, he goes to Jamaica to become the Jamaican outsource of that family legacy, because these then get sent up to New York in the 1760s as a wedding present for his niece. where they stay until the 20th century. So, yeah, so the objects move, the material moves, the wealth moves, and the wealth takes different forms. Whether it's tea at one moment, it becomes silver at another moment, or it becomes silk.
Yes. And I'm glad you thought about movement, because I'm going to ask us to zoom in and then zoom out again. We've been talking a lot about tea consumption, and although, Ramita, I'm sure some of the people drinking tea in their bedroom were not clothed, for the most part, no one is drinking tea. And so, I think we could take a moment and talk about what they're wearing. So looking again at our, poster child, and zooming in, not just to the fabulous Chinese porcelain on the wonderful shiny table, but also the shiny silk that that the woman is wearing. And this really is a reminder that the silk, as much as the mahogany table or the Chinese porcelain, is a global commodity. She's probably wearing English silk, and English silk was not, as those of you who spent time in the United Kingdom will understand, it's not the best place for, growing some natural resources. And so the raw materials from which the silk was then woven in England could have come from China, Turkey, Italy. Later, it will come from India, but this is a little bit before that economy has gotten developed. But so she is wearing a global product, even though it's manufactured in England, most likely. It is something that reflects this imperial global economy. And like tea, it has its origins in China. And as this wonderful copper plate engraving in the collections here illustrates, regardless of where the raw material of, the silk, and silk, by the way, is a beautiful luxury object that is made from a worm's spit. So, I think it's a really great reminder of this sort of brutal labor, whether it's of animals or humans, that undergirds so much of this beautiful luxury that we collect and display in our museums today. But as you can see, it sort of links back to the botanical story that Ramita was talking about, because mulberry leaves are necessary for the silkworms to consume and grow and create the cocoon that then becomes the source of their death, because they have to be killed before the silk can be woven. So really the Chinese, I think the origin stories of the mythology of a Chinese origin remains with silk, even if the raw materials or the finished product is not being made from China itself. And it also plays a huge role in the story of British imperial expansion, because as you can see from the pages open from a 1650 publication on the left, English and then British colonizers always hoped that colonial North America can become a silk-making part of their empire. And by that, they don't mean, of course, the loom and the weaving. They mean the raw materials. And they get really excited because they see lots of mulberries when they arrive in places like Virginia. It's not the right species for most silkworms to enjoy. So again, very interesting parallels in terms of botanicals and ecology. So it really strikes me that we're sort of talking about an ecology of beauty here in many ways, and an ecology of the senses. But this, I think, also speaks to the imaginative power that these commodities like tea and mahogany and silver and silk have, because it's, again, this marriage of the scientific with the aesthetic. And if you look down at the bottom right, you can see, I think, this is the most anthropomorphic looking silkworm in the world. And I think it really shows the fascination that people have with making this natural world into something that becomes a different product. And the way I want to bring this back to silk is, even though in places like Virginia, it doesn't really take off, it's a really important idea about the sort of imagination and drive that is also behind things like political protest, because I think it speaks to hope. So they're always hoping that they can make this work, even though they never quite do. But more successful is the exportation of botanicals from the colonies, from the Caribbean, from North America, that then become the basis of the fabled collections of plants, of exotic plants in places like Chelsea Physic Garden, which you see on the map on the right. And this gets me back to silk, because English silk designers become renowned in this time period for creating patterns that, as their contemporaries like to say, they always want to get a dig in at the French when they can, are, quote, very different from the gaudy patterns of the French. I think for those of you who have spent time with botanical illustrations, they're also clearly evoking that imagery of the cream background with the naturalistic botanical on top. And here you see some of the signature work of Anna Maria Garthwaite, who creates over 800 textile designs, and that becomes woven into fashions worn by a woman in England who wore this dress in the center from Victoria and Albert Museum. This same fabric in that dress also is worn by one of the Livingston women in New York. So a very direct link. But this is an example of some of those naturalistic patterns. You see aloes on the left, and on the right, you see spotted lilies. And this, again, she designed this pattern not long after John Bartram sent spotted lilies across the Atlantic, and they successfully survived the journey. Speaking of the journey of tea that we talked about yesterday, they successfully survived the journey and flourish in some gardens in England. And so I think you see here that, if you think about what the people drinking tea are wearing, what they're wearing is often just as linked to global trade, imperial commodities, and botanical networks as what they're consuming. So, not to, again, thinking about the fact they're not always maybe wearing clothes or silk when they're drinking tea, but, I think this really speaks to how much their world is saturated by this sort of global network. And then the last thing I want to mention about this, because I know that, Jenny, you're going to talk more about tea boycotts, and I think that all of us will talk more about the politicization of this, that tea is perhaps the most famous, but it's obviously not the only thing that Americans are boycotting. They also boycott silk, and I think this probably made a lot of people very sad who could not wear their fashions. And there's a flip side to textile boycotts that you don't quite see in the same way with tea, because I think things like dandelion tea never take off. A cup of dandelion tea is not going to be as satisfying as a cup of Lapsang Souchong, right? So, but with textiles, people like Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sally Franklin Bache, and Martha Washington, among others, try to politicize the production of textiles, of silk and calico, to replace things that they're no longer getting from the East India Company or importing from England. And here you see a few examples of that handiwork. You see a calico handkerchief on the left, which is attached to a story of origin by a calico manufacturer in Philadelphia. And it's an oral history attribution. And the reason it's an oral history attribution is that when the British occupied Philadelphia in 1778, one of the first things they burned to the ground was this calico manufactory, because Americans were not supposed to be making calico. That was for British producers and the East India Company to bring in. So this is very parallel to the Boston Tea Party in its intent and its revolutionary impact. Even though this example, which is from the Winterthur Museum, would have been made into a quilt for a bed. So a sort of functional Palambour parallel here. So yeah, I would love to hear if we could connect these sort of threads, and I'll tee you up, Jenny.
Yeah, so our last slide. I think to understand, why tea becomes such a flashpoint, you have to have attended this panel and the one yesterday. To really understand, when people were asked to boycott tea and tea drinking, how deep a sacrifice that felt for people, because it had such a deep cultural significance and had become, part of people's daily routines as well as their social interactions. And so one of the things that I've been really interested in is the way we see tea become politicized. And here an example of one of the accessories, right, being used to express critique of British policies regarding taxation, but on a teapot. So they're still consuming tea, but using it as a vehicle of political expression. But of course, we know that one of the most important ways, as Breen talks about this in his Marketplace of Revolution, one of the most important ways that ordinary people were able to express their frustration and to try and influence British policies was through what they consumed and what they chose not to. And so I was very amused and interested when I found this sermon that some of you may be familiar with. It was published in 1774 by a Charleston doctor, and it kind of, in my mind, goes along with this image of the women in North Carolina, pledging to refrain from tea consumption, which was published in London as sort of a satirical print making fun of these American women presuming to make their views known. And this Charleston doctor, he publishes something initially without his name, and it shows up in the Pennsylvania Gazette and other places in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. And it's published actually by the American Antiquarian Society, so you can go and look at the text if it's not familiar to you. But it's entitled A Sermon on Tea. Do you know this? Yes. And he uses the acronym TEA to levy a rather withering critique of people who aren't signing on to this non-importation and boycotting of British tea. And it's interesting, some historians have talked about that as a satire, but when you look at it in context, I actually think he was deadly serious when he wrote this. But he spells it out for Americans wavering in their loyalties one way or another. T stands for tattling. And he says it's very bad because it encourages people to indulge in tea table gossip. It's a waste of time, and it encourages people to be, libeling each other. E, extravagance. Not only is it a waste of time, but a waste of money. And he goes into great detail about, what a immoral decision it is to be spending money on expensive imports like tea rather than domestic products. And he wants all of us to drink steeped sage. Mm-hmm. And then interestingly, he talks about the absurdity of tea. And this mind, right, when it's such a central part of people's lives that he levies this critique. And here he explicitly makes it a gendered thing, where he says that tea drinking, in addition to being morally questionable and extravagant, that it's unhealthy. It encourages hysteria and nervous complaints, weakness and dissipation. And just as women are indulging in it, become gossips, he says that men who drink tea turn into women, his words, and women turn into who knows what.
He sounds so fun.
Yes. And so, but then he goes on to talk about the political absurdity of this, of a nation. And he characterizes tea as the secret weapon of the British Empire. He says that's intended to blow up American liberty and enslave its people. And he says that continuing to drink tea is an act of high treason and condemns anyone who would sell their country for tea. So being asked to refrain from your morning cup really was a political act.
So I'm going to jump in here a little bit, because your very provocative quote about women turning into men and men turning into women, let's not even contextualize it within current day discussions that are happening about this. But it brought to mind John Coakley Letsom's treatise on the natural history of tea, because there he talks about the anxiety of British men turning into effeminate characters and turning into Chinese people, which was the ultimate of insults, right? And my favorite word from that passage, it's dreadful, but my favorite word is pusillanimous, that you were turning into a pusillanimous character. So that's very interesting to read these anxieties about tea, especially at a time when it is creating economic anxieties because of silver, right, being drained by the China trade. Up until that point, tea is seen very much as a very sophisticated drink that even the Chinese emperor, of course, drinks out of fine porcelain. But as soon as the economic trade war begins, that is when all these sorts of cultural readings amplify. And this tells you how much human history has not changed, right? But bringing up silver, I'm just going to respond to a few things that all of you have said. It immediately also brought to mind the extent to which silver is, of course, not only fueling the China trade and other types of global trade, but that it takes us back to the mines, right, of Peru, of Bolivia, of Mexico, where you again have enslaved peoples who are both indigenous peoples as well as enslaved laborers brought from Africa to work in these mines, which are then, as you said, channeling silver across the world. And it's being used to also make heirloom tea services, right? All of you talked about tea and even silk as family items. And you talked about this intergenerational thing a little bit. And that really makes us think about the fact that we can't just conceptualize the story on a global scale, but ultimately it begins with the intimacy of social exchange, gossip, and flirting, disagreements at the tea table. And Frank Kwai, who's here in the audience yesterday, you did this wonderful tea ceremony where you reminded us of the smallness of things, the fact that mobility is also fueling a certain aesthetic of scale. And that's also, of course, connected to the fineness, the luxury, the refinement of each tea vessel. And it's the smallness that brings people together at the tea table in a certain kind of way, right? So we have to remember that these objects are not just luxury objects, but they are fueling a certain kind of spirit of whether it's patriotism, whether it's a sense of a broader scale of history. It's happening at a very intimate level. And Shati Chattopadhyay, this wonderful architectural historian, talks about small practices on a small scale that then can be scaled up for us to understand these broader global shifts, so to speak. I should also point out that, we've talked a lot about America, but Chinese porcelain is also collected by the great Mughal emperors in India. They have after all, India's had many empires. And so it's not just floating, flowing through the 18th century, but there's a whole history of intra-Asian trade as well among different nations within the Asian scene. So that was very, very, very interesting. When you talked about silk, Zara, it reminded me also of muslin, which is the most important luxury product coming out of the subcontinent at the time. So, if you think about the different textures, whether it's silk and whether it's this very fine diaphanous fabric that is, by the way, in every single painting. Once you start following these things, you see them everywhere in images. That's the problem with this, right? But I loved your reading of the botanical and the body in so many ways, because we're engaging not only with botanicals, but botanicals and gardens and landscapes. And tea, after all, is a plant that flowers, lest we forget. It is a camellia species. I should add, just to be very geeky over here, for a tea plant to flower for a tea planter is considered a plant in distress. For a gardener, that is what you want. You want the tea plant to flower. Also, for the scientist, you want the flower to come out, because then you can verify the species. And there are all these fabulous stories of how East India Company captains ship out, they're the ones who are shipping out tea plants to Europe. And Linnaeus asks for tea plants like every other major scientist at the time. And he's horrified when one of the plants turns out to be not a tea plant because of the flower that it produces. So it's a hoax. So, there's also a history of fraud that is weaving its way through this. There's so much of trial and error. So science is not just happening in this uninterrupted fashion, right? It's unfolding in very, very different ways. I love the image that you showed of the mulberry leaves stacked up in that image, because it reminded me of Athanasius Kircher's tea bush, also from the 17th century. He's a Jesuit priest, never visits China, but comes up with all sorts of illustrations of the tea plant. And there you actually see tea leaves stacked up at the bottom of this tea bush, sort of zooming into the actual organic matter, the botanical matter that produces the profit in the end, right? So very, very interesting. And John, going back to your slides and the Palampur fabric that you showed us and the tea caddy, again, and connecting with your presentation with the tea tables, I was thinking about ivory in India that was used to make a fabulous tea table for Warren Hastings and his wife that were gifted to him by a local Nawab coming from Murshidabad. So you have mahogany being used on one side, you have ivory on the other. So if you think, and it's the same form, it's the same form that is being carved in different ways, right? Through these different kinds of objects. And I'm not entirely biased here, but I am actually, because I grew up born and raised in the city of Calcutta. I just have to point this out, that Calcutta has the second oldest consulate, American consulate in the world. And it's George Washington who appoints a Boston-based merchant, Benjamin Joy, in 1792 to become the representative in Calcutta of the American government. And this will be followed by another Boston merchant who will become the first American consul in Canton, in Guangzhou, sort of the hub of the China trade. In China for all the Americans and Europeans, especially. So there are all these interesting figures weaving in and out of this. And I just wanted to say that the merchant plays such an important role here, right? Merchants who are collaborating with the scientists, who are collaborating with clergymen, with captains, with navigators. So they really rise as the new figures, shall we say, of political mediations here, taste, and in many ways are driving all the stories that we're talking about. So we're shifting from an aristocratic model to a mercantile model, which is a very profound shift if you think about it, right? So just some stories to tell over here. Yeah, and I hope you all visit Calcutta someday, because if you want to see a real tea city in the world, that's where you come to. You'll see it all. It's still very much the hub of the entire tea, and you'll still see tea auctions, etc. So and fabulous furniture, by the way, as well. So it's very, very interesting to see how all the patterns you've talked about flow into and out of India as well.
Some questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think it's time now. We have 11:07. We have some time for questions. So maybe we open up to our audience, and I hope we haven't put you to sleep.
Can I start?
Yes,
is it unfair since I'm holding the mic? Thank you for this amazing panel. I'm so taken by this satiric print and the sermon that you described, because much of the act of protest that you were describing involves not doing things, not wearing silk, not consuming tea, tea in its dangerous forms. And those of you who saw the Hogarth yesterday, I had an interesting conversation following about the potential sort of sexual undertones in that painting, with the gestures and where hands were pointing and the pregnant dog on top of the teenage boy, sort of what we were supposed to gain from that. So I'm struck that what occurs to me as a plausible and outcome of not engaging in those leisurely activities is that women might get involved in political acts. And here it's clearly seen as a negative. But I'm curious, like, what was the substitute? What was the positive or hopeful substitute that people were intended to be engaged in if they weren't actually succumbing to the absurdity or the luxury of consuming tea and other objects?
Yeah, well, it was very much geared toward trying to shift from reliance on imports to domestic production. And so, for example, all over New England, they had spin-ins where young women would bring their spinning wheel and come down to the common green, and they would be making homemade spinning linen or wool for homemade production rather than to import textiles. There was a big push to use maple syrup instead of imported sugar. And yes, I don't think Starbucks would have thrived as well, but they were suggesting that instead of imported tea, you should be growing sage and dandelion and other herbal things in the garden that would become the substitutes. And it really was geared toward economic self-reliance. And people embraced it, some of it, and in some ways they whined mightily. And there were committees that went around and harassed people who were found to be drinking tea naked in their bedroom. Yeah, secretly.
And if I could just add to that, go back and show you, I never explained why Queen Marie Antoinette was on the screen. And the reason she's on the screen is that she's an example of what women wanted to do themselves as political acts of production rather than consumption. In this case, it was Sally Franklin Bache, Benjamin Franklin's daughter, long-suffering daughter, I will say. And she wrote to him in France and asked for some finery, lace, et cetera, to wear to a ball. And he wrote back and said, wear your textiles till they get into rags and then they'll look like lace. And so her rejoinder to him was to show that she was productive, and she sent him 22 yards of homespun Pennsylvania grown silk as a gift for Marie Antoinette to celebrate the Franco-American Alliance. And this worked because he then said, well, since you are a good girl and you continue to knit and spin, I will send you the things you ask for. But I don't know how it came into your head to send silk to a queen since you barely have shoes to your feet. But he kept the silk for himself and made a suit. And I'm sure strutted around, France making a statement. But, she was very clever because she was able to ask for consumer goods by proving that she was frugal and productive. So it's a really fascinating story about how women are struggling to create a political role for themselves that won't lead them to be villainized in all of these ways that you were talking about, Ramita, that you see here in the Edenton Tea Party, which shows women, looking like men and being hypersexualized, and another dog who's up to no good. So yeah.
I want to push back on the idea that a boycott is a passive act. We think that I'm just going to say no, but a boycott is hugely active. And you think about all the non-importation agreements that are being written and drafted, all the committee meetings. You have the individual acts of these women who are taking manufacturing into the home. But you also have major scale manufacturers ramping up production in this period. I've written about the glass houses in Pennsylvania. You have Willem Stiegel, who's going door to door saying, buy American, and he's changing his entire production line, which had been very German-centric to his community. He's anglicizing his production line to appeal to an Anglo audience. So you have, it's a fascinating shift that the simple act of saying no means saying yes to a lot of other things that will then take the space of it. So it's this fascinating tension.
Like that calico manufacturer, it's the same, similar story.
So I'm going to push back a little bit now. We're all pushing. Mini revolution happening. But going back to Zara's point, I was thinking about Marie Antoinette and her love of muslin as well. I mean, chemise à la reine is all Bengal muslin that she's wearing, right? So aside from that, I was thinking back to what you were saying, John, about the boycott, and how big a boycott is it even, in a sense, even though it's happening, tea is still flowing through America, right? So that too is an interesting reading in terms of how much of it is really about boycotting English tea versus the Dutch smuggling networks. There's so many other sort of layers to this story. And it's really the loss of the North American colonies that will shift attention to the emphasis on India, actually, more than anything else. And sugar, interestingly enough, is then discussed as a product that one should be cultivating in India, because it's already being produced there, because of what is going on with the North American scene. So there's a lot of discussion about sugar and starting a whole new plantation economy around sugar to boycott the sugar that's coming out of here, but back in Bengal. So many other types of sort of ruptures happening in this history. And, if we fast forward, going back to your question, Christine, I was thinking about the suffragists and their tea sets that they will make that are commissioned by the suffragists. So there are whole sort of American suffragist teapots, right, that will follow later on. So the story doesn't just begin and end with the 18th century. It continues to flow, and you said, bleed and leak into the other centuries as well. Anybody else?
I love it. We've said everything.
Island. So the one plant that we haven't talked about is opium, but we should probably at some point touch on that. But we have a custom. Yeah.
I have a silly question. I should know this and it's embarrassing, but like, where does the word tea come from? Because it's not like chai, like you referenced, Ramita, the Athanasius Kircher images. When does it become?
Thea comes from the word thea itself.
Okay.
So chai is, I think, the Cantonese word, and thea is also used in China as well.
Okay.
Yeah. From Thai, I think it's coming from that.
I'm sort of fascinated by the way that words are working on objects.
Yeah.
In this whole conversation, just like I'm staring at the No Stamp Act pot. And so thinking about that, but also thinking about the way that the word tea becomes the place where you have this interplay where you're breaking down exactly all the behaviors that tea comes to stand for that you don't want people to be engaged in. And because I'm obsessed with these redware tea canisters, I'm going to bring it back to that too, that there's another similar piece made by the same maker as the piece at Yale at the Met. I think it's the one, no, maybe it's the one at Winterthur, but there's one at the Met and there's one at Winterthur. And there, one of these pieces has on it the word simply, in addition to the palimpor motif, you know, the tree motif, it has the word just tea on it spelled out in capital letters. And then the word is, the letters are interspersed with like a spoon, a little, sgraffito drawing of a spoon, and then like a scale to weigh tea. So it's sort of like the self-referential image and word interplay that's happening on the object itself. So I don't know if there's a question there or just a comment, really.
One of the things I didn't include an image of, but I was looking at examples of them just the other day, is that there's, as this, affiliated artifacts are proliferating, one of the things that you begin to see is sets of tea canisters that have the type of tea, like in, painted on, where it's an integral part of the glaze of the object. So it has, it's made by, intentionally for a particular type of thin glaze earthenware, for example, where it's not that the label's been added later, but it's in the object, and you would buy it as a set. And to me, that just speaks of this growing cultural literacy that tea becomes, the diversified, and they're all different kinds of tea. And today, I think that's become, again, kind of a high-end thing of people being literate in different kinds of tea and what their various qualities are. And then there's this sort of generic Lipton tea that who knows quite what that is. But at the time, that was considered part of mastering this new world of material culture, was to be able to know what kind of tea would go in these different canisters.
Yeah, and you also showed that locked box, which I think was right on target, right? That it was kept under lock and key. And often it's the women who would be in charge, the woman of the household, who's the head of the household, who would serve the tea. She was in charge of unlocking that tea chest. And I just wanted to bring up another thing that we see in the records in Calcutta, for instance. If you look at the Bengal Gazette from exactly the time period that we're talking about, that there are stories about people stealing people's silver. So there's a lot of anxiety about personhood enmeshed or entangled with silver tea services, among other silver objects. And since opium is kicking around my head, I have to mention this before I forget, is that, when we look at silver fueling the tea trade, one of the things that the British do is they grow opium precisely to edge out their Dutch rivals. So once they flood the market with opium, they're able to undercut the Dutch silver inflow into the tea trade. And that's when the monopoly shifts to the British East India Company. So again, silver and opium are also interlinked in this very, very interesting, a completely different product, but of course enmeshed with the history of tea as well. So just wanted to point that out.
Just to Lily's point, this does say Esther Smith per tea canister.
Ah.
The possessive is so important. And like on the Simeon Sumain sugar bowl, the cipher is EC, Elizabeth Kruger. It's not the husband. Like the men are kind of taken out of the picture in many of these objects. And although they're in the room, they're in the paintings, often it's they're inadvertently paying for a lot of these things. We're in a very gendered world, which then takes you back to how the silk is manifested, how these objects are manifested. But yeah, just always objects that speak for themselves. It's always great to listen to what they're saying.
And since you have the palampur up,
Yes.
I should mention, and this has nothing to do with either of these objects, but it's reminding me of the fact that when tea is found in its wild growing state in India, in that picture that I showed you, the lithograph in Assam, the tea tree will grow up to 15 to 25 feet. And we forget that is actually a tree that can grow. It's not to be confused with the other tea tree oil that you use. Is coming from a totally different species. But the fact that it can grow up to 35 feet. So if you think about the tree as a motif, right, then that is literally compressed into a tea bush. So the history of the tree, whether it's mahogany, whether it's tea, whether it's even this imaginary palampur fabric, there's a manipulation of the plant itself, be it fictive, be it actual, that is then creating all the textures, whether it's the fine grain of those mahogany tables or ultimately the tea bush that is calibrated in such a way that it produces more leaf. The more you press it down, more you compress it, it's forced to throw out more leaf. And that's when you get your tea. So it all connects back to the palampur.
Everything is more delicious under pressure.
But I think we should probably wrap up now, unless there's any questions. Well, to be continued over the break. It's 11:32. So thank you all for being here, for listening, for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.